There are moments in history when civilizations collide, when one world meets another so utterly different that the result changes the course of continents. The year 1241 was one of those moments. From the frozen steppes of Asia came a storm unlike anything Europe had ever faced, a storm of speed, discipline, and terror. In just a few short years, entire kingdoms had been erased from the map. And now, that storm was rolling into the heart of Europe. This is the story of how the unstoppable Mongol Empire met the proud armies of Christendom. A confrontation that would shatter the illusion of European invincibility and echo through the centuries. April 1241, Western Poland. The greatest military machine the medieval world had ever seen was about to clash with the flower of European knighthood. Over the next 3 days, the fields near Legnica would become a graveyard for ideals, courage, and entire armies. But before understanding the scale of what happened there, one must understand who these Mongols were. They were not the barbaric horde European chroniclers later imagined. They were the inheritors of Genghis Khan's revolutionary system of warfare, a perfectly organized, perfectly disciplined engine of conquest that had devoured half the known world in barely 2 generations. Every Mongol warrior could ride before he could walk. He could loose an arrow with deadly accuracy at full gallop. He could survive for weeks on nothing but fermented mare's milk and dried meat, crossing distances that would exhaust European armies in days. By 1241, the Mongol Empire stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the borders of Germany. The cities of Central Asia lay in ruins. The mightiest Islamic kingdoms had been crushed. Even China's Great Wall, once thought impregnable, had fallen before their relentless advance. Now, under the command of Bada Khan, grandson of Genghis himself, 3 Tumans, around 30,000 men, had devastated Kiev, swept across Hungary, and now turned toward Poland. But this invasion was no act of random destruction. It was a coordinated campaign designed to neutralize any threat to the Mongols' western flank before they moved deeper into Europe. Bada divided his armies. One force stormed through Hungary under his direct command. Another, led by the generals Baidar and Khadan, struck north through Poland, burning, destroying, and dismantling resistance before it could unite. Lublin was torched. Sandomierz was sacked. Kalisz and Krakow were reduced to ashes. Their next target was Silesia, one of Poland's richest duchies. There, Duke Henry II of Silesia, remembered as Henry the Pious, prepared for the storm. He had received desperate messages from the east, each one more horrifying than the last. Whole cities wiped from existence in a single day. Populations massacred to the last soul. Armies annihilated in hours. The report spoke of devils on horseback, men who fought with supernatural precision, appearing from nowhere and vanishing like ghosts. But Henry was no coward. A veteran commander and devout Christian, he understood the stakes. If the Mongols were not stopped here, all of Europe lay open before them. He sent urgent appeals across Poland, Bohemia, and the Holy Roman Empire, for this was no longer a Polish war. It was a battle for Christendom itself. The call was answered. The Knights Templar, the legendary warrior monks of the Crusades, rode to his aid. The Teutonic Knights, hardened from their brutal campaigns in the Baltic, marched south with their heavy cavalry. Polish nobles set aside their rivalries and raised their banners. Duke Mieszko of Opole brought his men. Moravian infantry marched north. Even miners from Silesia's gold pits, men who had never held a sword, volunteered to defend their land and faith. Monastic chroniclers would later claim that 100,000 Christians gathered to face the Mongols. But this was a hopeful exaggeration born of terror. Modern historians estimate Henry's force at perhaps 25 to 40,000 men, still one of the largest armies ever assembled in Eastern Europe. For perspective, William the Conqueror had taken England with around 10,000. Even the Crusades rarely fielded armies larger than 30,000. Against them stood 2 Tumans, roughly 20,000 Mongols, under Baidar and Khadan, both seasoned generals of noble lineage. Baidar was a grandson of Genghis Khan. Khadan, the son of the great Khan Ogdi. They were not mere warriors. They were strategists trained in the art of deception, ambush, and psychological warfare. Years before this invasion, Mongol spies had already traveled through Europe disguised as merchants, learning its roads, its fortresses, and its military habits. They knew exactly how knights fought and how to destroy them. The European knight was the tank of the medieval battlefield, hundreds of pounds of man, steel, and horse charging in a single thunderous wave. Against unprepared foes, that charge could be unstoppable. But the Mongols had studied its weaknesses. The knights were slow, weighed down by armor. Their horses tired quickly. Their discipline often crumbled in the heat of pursuit. And above all, their tactics relied on close combat. While the Mongols were masters of striking from afar, killing the enemy before he could ever draw his sword. April 7th, 1241, dawn. The allied European army advanced from Legnica in glorious formation. At the center rode the heavy cavalry, knights gleaming in steel and chain mail, their banners fluttering in the cold spring wind. Each man's armor was worth the income of an entire village. Their destriers, enormous warhorses bred for strength, pawed the earth impatiently, nostrils flaring. On the flanks marched the infantry, Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, and Silesian miners carrying axes and hammers. Priests moved among the ranks, blessing weapons and hearing confessions. The Black Cross of the Teutonic Order, the Red Cross of the Templars, and the White Eagle of Poland rose proudly above them. It must have been a magnificent sight, the combined strength of Christian Europe, united in purpose and faith. And then, on the horizon, appeared a line of dust. Not the heavy, steady cloud of marching infantry, but something faster, lighter, and eerily fluid. The storm had arrived. The first Mongol riders emerged like specters on the horizon, their silhouettes flickering in the morning haze. They rode small, sturdy horses that looked more like ponies compared to the towering European warhorses. The sight drew laughter from the knights. Were these the infamous Mongols who had conquered half the known world? These small men, mounted on such unimpressive animals, seemed laughably weak. Surely, a single charge would crush them beneath armored hooves. But the illusion of superiority shattered quickly. The Mongols advanced just close enough to be within their own arrow range, far beyond that of any European bow. From their recurved composite bows, crafted from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, they unleashed a storm of arrows. Each shaft whistled through the air and fell in deadly arcs upon the European ranks. Then, without warning, the horsemen wheeled their mounts and retreated in perfect formation. Cowards, the Polish knights roared, pounding their shields. They flee like rabbits. But this was no retreat born of fear. It was deliberate, disciplined, and devastatingly effective. For hours, the Mongols repeated the same rhythm: advance, fire, retreat, wearing down their enemy one arrow at a time. Each warrior carried 60 arrows, and their supply horses hundreds more. With 20,000 riders, they rained over 1,000,000 arrows upon the Europeans. It was not a battle. It was a calculated equation of death. The Europeans stood firm, shields raised, enduring the relentless barrage. Yet morale began to crumble. These men were trained for chivalric combat, glorious charges, and honorable duels. But the Mongols refused to meet them on those terms. Instead, they turned the knights into helpless targets. Horses screamed as arrows slipped through the cracks in their armor. Men shouted curses as shafts pierced the joints of their mail. The infantry, poorly protected, fell in heaps. Duke Henry ordered his crossbowmen to return fire, but their weapons were far too slow. By the time a bolt was loosed, the Mongols were already out of range. The Templars begged for permission to charge. Henry refused. He understood the trap. This was how the Mongols lured their enemies to destruction. Yet holding position while being picked apart was equally unbearable. As the sun sank behind the hills, the battlefield grew quiet. Hundreds of Europeans were dead or writhing in pain. Horses had to be put down where they stood. The screams of the dying filled the air long after the fighting ended. The Mongols, by contrast, had lost perhaps a dozen men. That night, the steppe flickered with distant lights. The Mongols made camp just beyond sight, their fires glowing like scattered stars. Then the drums began, slow, rhythmic, and ceaseless. All through the night, the pounding of Mongol war drums kept the Europeans awake, fraying their nerves and deepening their dread. April 8th, 1241. Dawn rose blood-red, a bad omen, even to the priests. The European army reassembled, weary and hollow-eyed. Many of the wounded had died in the night. Arguments broke out between commanders. The Polish nobles accused the Templars of cowardice. The Teutonic Knights demanded a full charge. Duke Mieszko of Opole threatened to withdraw if they continued to stand and die in place. Duke Henry knew he could not hold them together much longer. When Mongol riders reappeared at dawn, repeating their harassment tactics, he made a desperate choice. He ordered Duke Mieszko to lead a partial charge, 2,000 knights, the pride of Poland. The ground trembled beneath their armored horses as they thundered forward, lances lowered, banners flying. The Mongols turned and fled once more, seemingly terrified. A roar of triumph rose from the knights. "We have them!" Mieszko shouted. "Glory to Christ! Kill them all!" The chase stretched for miles across the plains. The Europeans' heavy horses began to tire, their armor weighing them down. Yet the Mongols always remained just ahead, turning occasionally to fire a few mocking arrows before galloping away. Some nobles began to sense danger, but Mieszko, consumed by fury and pride, pressed on. It was exactly what the Mongols wanted. The feigned retreat, their deadliest weapon, had worked again. As the Polish formation stretched thin and disorganized, the trap closed. From hidden positions in the rolling terrain, Mongol heavy cavalry appeared, yes, heavy cavalry, fully armored and disciplined. From both flanks, light horsemen encircled the pursuers like wolves surrounding wounded prey. Mieszko saw the truth too late. His knights were surrounded, cut off from the main army, trapped on open ground where their strength counted for nothing. What followed was slaughter. The Mongols did not fight for glory. They fought to annihilate. Circling their prey, they loosed endless volleys until the ground was littered with bodies and dying horses. Any knight who tried to break free was driven back by perfectly timed countercharges. Only when the Polish force was reduced to chaos did the Mongol heavy cavalry strike. Lances and sabers finished what the arrows had begun. Mieszko fought valiantly, reportedly killing a dozen enemies before 5 arrows pierced him. His bodyguards made a final stand, singing death songs as they were cut down one by one. Of the 2,000 who had charged that morning, fewer than 200 returned to Duke Henry's camp. Those who survived were shattered men. They spoke of enemies who moved like a single organism, who seemed to communicate without words, whose discipline was beyond human. One knight, his armor pierced by 7 arrows, died whispering over and over, "They are not men. They are not men." As darkness fell again, a lone Mongol rider approached Henry's camp. He carried a small package. Inside was the severed head of Duke Mieszko, preserved in salt. Attached to it was a message written in crude Latin, simple, cold, and final, tomorrow, Day 3, April 9th, 1241, the day that would come to be known as the Day of Annihilation. The dawn rose pale and cold over the plains near Legnica, and with it came despair. Inside Duke Henry's war council, fear hung thicker than the morning mist. The proud banners of Poland, Silesia, and Moravia still fluttered, but behind them, morale was collapsing. Nearly a quarter of Henry's army was gone, dead, wounded, or scattered. The Moravian infantry, exhausted and demoralized, were whispering of desertion. Several Polish nobles had already fled in the night with their retinues, abandoning the cause entirely. Yet Henry of Silesia, grim and resolute, knew that retreat was suicide. On the open plains, the Mongol cavalry would hunt them down like prey. There was no escape. The only path left was to stand, to fight, and perhaps to die with honor. Henry chose his battlefield carefully, a broad open field near the village of Legnica, known in Latin chronicles as Legnica. The terrain offered a faint hope, a gentle rise in the center that would give his archers some elevation, and a small stream on one flank that could prevent a complete encirclement. He arranged his forces with methodical precision born of desperation. At the center stood the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Order, warriors of faith who would never flee. On the right flank, he placed the Polish knights, the flower of his nobility. On the left, he deployed the remnants of his infantry, townsmen, peasants, and mercenaries from Bohemia and Moravia. Henry himself held command over the reserve, keeping a few hundred mounted men near his banner, ready to plug any breach. As the morning mist began to thin, dark shapes appeared on the horizon. The Mongols had come, but something was different. They weren't charging in their usual elegant, shifting formations. Instead, they seemed to be preparing strange contraptions, large cauldrons mounted on wooden frames with wheels. The Europeans watched in confusion. Were these cooking pots? Ritual instruments for some pagan ceremony? No one knew. Then, with a hiss and roar that no one present had ever heard before, the cauldrons exploded into life. Thick black smoke poured forth, rolling across the fields like a living creature. The stench of sulfur and burnt pitch filled the air. Within moments, visibility dropped to nothing. The carefully aligned European formation dissolved into chaos. These were not cannons. Those would not appear in Europe for another century, but early gunpowder smoke bombs, technology the Mongols had mastered through their conquests in northern China. The innovation was devastating. Soldiers coughed violently, choking as the acrid fumes filled their lungs. Commands vanished in the confusion. Horns and drums were drowned by the coughing and shouting. Banners, the medieval system of battlefield communication, disappeared into the smoke. Then, the Mongols struck with something even more insidious. Days earlier, they had captured several Polish prisoners. They had not killed them. Instead, they forced them to teach a few words in Polish. Uciekajcie, Stracini gestismi, run, all is lost. Now, hidden within the smoke, Mongol horsemen shouted these phrases in perfect imitation. Across the battlefield, Polish soldiers heard voices, familiar voices, crying out in their own tongue. Believing their commanders had ordered retreat, units began to panic. The confusion spread like wildfire. Men trampled one another, trying to flee. Knights stumbled into their own infantry. Horses reared and screamed in terror. The infantry on the left flank was the first to collapse. Peasants threw down their weapons and fled into the woods. This exposed the flank of the center, where the Templars and Teutonic Knights held firm, surrounded and cut off. These warrior monks, trained to fight to the death, refused to yield. The Mongols struck them from every direction. Arrows whistled through the smoke. Curved sabers flashed in the dim light. The Templars formed a circle and fought with grim, silent determination, each man knowing he would not leave the field alive. Their Grand Master, Pondobon, was found later with 23 arrows in his body, his sword broken in half, surrounded by piles of Mongol dead. The Teutonic Knights attempted to break out, forming a wedge formation and charging blindly into the gray fog. Against all odds, they broke through the Mongol lines and emerged onto open ground, but it was a hollow victory. The Mongol cavalry, unburdened by heavy armor, pursued them relentlessly. One by one, the armored knights were overtaken and cut down. Their horses, exhausted and terrified, collapsed beneath them, trapping them in their own armor as they were slaughtered. Duke Henry, watching the destruction unfold, made the fatal decision to ride forward and rally his men. Raising his banner high, he charged into the fray, calling his soldiers to him. For a brief, shining moment, hope flickered. Scattered Polish knights began to regroup, forming around the ducal banner. But then, fate intervened. From somewhere in the swirling smoke, a Mongol archer loosed an arrow. It struck Henry under the arm, finding the weak point in his armor. He swayed but did not fall. His guards surrounded him, desperate to protect their duke, but the Mongols had seen the banner and knew their target. They descended upon him with terrifying precision. Henry's guards were cut down one after another. His horse collapsed beneath him, throwing him to the ground. Wounded and bleeding, he was taken alive. The Mongol commanders, recognizing his courage, offered him a quick death, an honorable end for a valiant foe. Henry refused, saying he would die as he had lived, as a Christian knight. Moments later, he was beheaded. His severed head was mounted on a spear and carried before the Mongol army as they paraded through the captured towns. When his mother later searched the battlefield for his body, she could identify it only by his left foot. He had been born with 6 toes. By noon, the field of Legnica was a charnel pit. The Mongols, following their custom, cut off the right ear of every fallen enemy to count the dead. Contemporary accounts claimed they filled 9 great leather sacks. Between 10 and 25,000 Europeans lay slain. The nobility of Silesia was nearly wiped out. The great military orders, the Templars and Teutonic Knights, lost so many men that it would take decades to rebuild. In contrast, Mongol losses were negligible, fewer than 700 by modern estimates. The field was covered in corpses so thick that one could walk for hundreds of yards without touching the ground. Carrion birds blotted out the sun. The smell of death hung for weeks, and for decades afterward, peasants would still find bones when they plowed their fields. The psychological shock of the defeat was as devastating as the physical one. News of the disaster spread across Europe in weeks. In Paris, King Louis IX began fortifying the city's walls and training his army in new tactics. In Rome, Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade, not to liberate Jerusalem, but to save Christendom from annihilation. Even the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, long at odds with the papacy, suddenly found both sides contemplating peace in the face of this new threat. A German chronicler wrote in horror, "The Mongols are the scourge of God. They fight not as men, but as demons, without fear, without mercy." The defeat at Legnica shattered Europe's faith in its own military system. The knight, the armored nobleman who embodied the ideals of courage and chivalry, had proven powerless against a mobile, disciplined, and coordinated enemy. The Mongols fought not for honor, but for victory, and they had shown that cunning and adaptability could destroy even the most exalted traditions. Yet from this humiliation, Europe began to learn. Within a generation, European armies adopted new strategies, coordinated formations, archery support, and early gunpowder weapons. The medieval code of individual heroism gave way to the discipline of organized warfare. Then, in December 1241, fate again intervened. The great Khan Ogedai died suddenly in Mongolia. Some said from overindulgence in drink, others whispered from poison. By Mongol law, every prince of the royal blood had to return home to elect a new ruler. Bada Khan, despite his victories, withdrew from Europe to obey the law. The invasion stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The West was spared, not by valor or strategy, but by the death of a man thousands of miles away. The Mongols never returned so deep into Europe again. Internal strife and the vast distances of their empire halted further campaigns. Yet the memory of Legnica burned in the European mind. It forced an awakening, a recognition that survival depended on evolution. It was a lesson written in blood: adapt or perish. Today, the site of the battle is a quiet stretch of farmland in modern Poland. A modest monument stands where Duke Henry is believed to have fallen. Each April, reenactors gather there, dressed in armor, carrying banners, trying to relive that terrible morning. But no reenactment can capture what truly happened: the smoke, the screams, the thunder of hooves, the end of an age. In just 3 days, the Mongols didn't merely destroy an army. They destroyed a worldview. They tore down the myth of European invincibility and ushered in a new era, one defined not by faith or chivalry, but by adaptability, discipline, and the relentless logic of survival. 3 days that changed the world forever.